Yeah, I can still see that people are coming in, but let's try to be efficient and timely and start this on time. So welcome everyone to this Friday webinar that we have usually. Sorry, I need to do this. Sorry, now I'm ready to go. So welcome everyone. I'm really happy to see that so many people have joined us today for this webinar. As you can probably see, we have International Sign Language interpretation, and we also have live captioning, which is included in the Zoom closed captioning functionality. And we will also provide you with a specific link for those of you who would prefer to have the captioning on the side. And we also have a Swedish automatic translation of the captions for those of you who would like that, for all our Swedish and Norwegian and Danish listeners. And for those of you who would like the translation, then there is a drop-down menu where you need to choose to have the Swedish translation. So, but Eva can help you if you ask questions in the chat. Any technical questions can be covered by my colleague Eva. So today we are going to have a little longer program than we usually have on the Friday webinars because we have exciting speakers. So we will start off with a presentation from Gareth Ford Williams, whom I almost woke up this morning to make sure that he could join us.
You did wake up.
That was because I know he's one of the few people who I can wake up in the middle of the night and ask him to do a presentation with absolutely no warning or preparation, and he will do a brilliant job. So the reason I needed to wake him up was because our original speaker, Jamie, with his lion, he is not well. He's actually in hospital. He sent his greetings to all of you, but the doctor said he could not make an event from his hospital bed, which was what he wanted to do. So let's hope that he will get better very soon. And in the meantime, we can listen to Gareth, which I know will be very, very good. So Gareth is also from the BBC. And then after that short presentation, being the end user perspective of this, which is of course what we always want to start with, we start always from the end user. Then we will have the presentation of the project with one of my dearest colleagues, Sarah, who will present the national research project that we have been now doing for over, I think, 3 years. On criteria for cognitive accessibility, which I hope is what you're all here for. And then we will turn to a panel with very distinguished panelists. We have Shadi Abuzara from the W3C. Gareth will join us also for the panel, and also Sarah, of course. And then we have another dear friend of mine, Christian Bühler from the Technical University of Dortmund, who is a specialist in cognitive accessibility, and we've been working in many interesting research projects recently. And then we have another jump in, Bart de Klerk from the Federal Belgian Agency for Monitoring of Web Accessibility, which has a long name I can't remember, but really that is what they're doing. And he also, I didn't wake him up actually, but I also asked him very early this morning because Peter Kemeny, who is an ex-DG Connect European Commission staff member, he also was prohibited from joining us today, unfortunately. But we did get the end user perspective in place, and we did get the policy perspective. So we still have the same setup, and I know that these new speakers will do a brilliant job. After the panel, we will have room for Q&A. So if you do have a question during the presentations, please write them in the Q&A function, and we will make sure to try to answer them as many of them as we can in the open Q&A session. And then we will try to wrap up and stop the session at 3 o'clock Central Europe time. And I did see the comments on us not being clear on the time zone. We have got that from several, and I'm really sorry about that. And we will just try to make it better next time. But you are here, so somewhere or another you knew what time it was supposed to be. Okay, so if you, I don't know if you managed to make slides, Gareth, or if you just want to speak freely. That's entirely up to you, of course. But you are welcome to share your screen if you would like to, or otherwise, I will just give the floor.
I've got some slides. I've got some slides, and yes, it's. I think I can use the slideshow. Hopefully,
you should be able to.
It's
you
all
are
gone dark. Can you see that? So I put use the slides up. Can you see the slides?
I don't see them yet. So do we...
Try one more time, Gareth. I made you co-host just to be on the safe side.
Okay.
It should have worked before still, but...
I'm now trying to work out how to get out of this. I think I shared the slides before you made me co-host, and now none of the controls are popping up.
Yeah, this is the new life we are all living, with technology helping us and sometimes not helping us so much.
Yes. I seem to be in screen mode. I'm just going to take out full screen mode. Anyway, I'll talk a little bit about myself and start going. So my name is Gareth Ford-Williams. I'm head of UX design at the BBC, and I'm trying to share screen at the minute. You cannot modify the advanced sharing options, so I can't share my screen at the minute. Don't think. There we go. Let's try that.
Yes. Now
Have
we
you
see
managed to? Yes, fantastic.
Good.
So if I make that full screen, is that working?
It's fantastic. Beautiful.
Fabulous, fabulous. So yes, so my name's Gareth Williams. I'm a head of UX, one of the UX design at BBC. I have ADHD. I'm dyslexic, according to Jamie. I'm probably autistic as well. Jamie did a wonderful job of actually making that point in a BBC training video that I didn't know about until it was played at an event where I was at stage. It's like, thanks, Jay. But that's it. He was like, well, you probably are. So, but I have traits. We share a lot of traits, Jamie and I. Jamie is also, he's autistic, he has ADHD. But as Jamie always says, you meet one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. You know, we're all very, very different, and we all have and autism, ADHD, and dyslexia are all generally kind of they're all different in different people in different ways. I mean, there are obviously, you know, hard medical things behind them. You know, it's dyslexia is a condition that affects the audio center of the brain. You know, ADHD is about my frontal lobes and basal ganglia, etc. So we know what causes them, but the way it manifests is always slightly different.
Gareth, you're speaking extremely fast. Please remember.
I am going
Yes.
to slow down. Thank you very much. Another trait of the of Gareth's. So I will move on to the next slide. So as I said, I'm dyslexic, and I'm an ADHD-er. I struggle with the title ADHD. There's no person-centered language around ADHD, and I'm going to focus mostly on ADHD in this talk. I like to use the word Tigger because you can be dyslexic, you can be autistic, you can be dyspraxic. You know, everyone has a name, you know, that they can own, but for ADHD, for some reason, it's missing. Also, yeah, apologies. This was version 0.3.1 last time I gave it, and from this morning I've spent a whole 15 minutes reorganizing it for hopefully a shorter version, and so it comes with a lot of warnings. This is sort of structured. The slides are probably more use to me than they are of you. They enable me to keep on track and remind me of what I'm supposed to be talking about. I have an appalling short-term memory, so I might forget what point I plan to make or what point I am trying to make. I also go off on tangents and get a little lost, so hopefully these pull me. Lost words also lead to anxiety, which leads to more lost words. So sometimes I forget words, so a pause usually is I'm trying to remember the word I can remember the abstract concept for. So as I said, ADHD, there are very much brain differences. It's a developmental disorder, and similar to dyslexia. How many people have ADHD? We're not entirely sure. As with autism and dyslexia, you know, the way that we screen for it is all designed around manifests in boys. So lots and lots of girls slip through the net. We don't know, because since before 1989, there was no screening in schools in the UK or the US. I'm not quite sure what it's like for the rest of Europe, but I'm pretty sure it is going to be a fairly similar picture. So we really don't know. 5% children, girls. By the way, it's a lifelong condition. Anyone who says that they used to have ADHD did not have ADHD. You don't suddenly, your brain does not suddenly change overnight. Usually people are talking about that is they've learned really good masking. And so they've got past some of the problems and they present in a different way, but masking is not cure. So 3% of adults masking, 30% of the UK's population, prison population, they have actually done screening in 2 of the UK's prisons, which is quite an interesting statistic. Another lovely statistic of a 40% more chance of dying before 40 if you have ADHD. We looked into this and I talked to the NHS about it, and I thought, is this to do with the anxiety and depression goes with it? And there's a lot of people who go into substance abuse, and they said, no, it's mostly things like falling out of trees. So to talk about ADHD itself, hyperactivity, compulsion, get distracted very easily, can be quite reactive, don't have much of a filter, what usually comes out. It's why there's so many stand-up that have ADHD. One called Rory Bremner, who's a very well-known one in the UK. I got to speak to him quite recently, and he said if it wasn't for his ADHD, it wouldn't be funny, because half the time he hears the joke at the same time the audience does. Short-term memory losses, obviously it's not everyone, but these are quite common things. Little choice of focus. I can really focus, I just can't necessarily choose what it is that I'm focusing on. I miss social cues a lot, can become hyper-focused, not very good with structure, can get very, very obsessive about things, can get very, very emotional, and as I already said, short-term memory loss. As cognition is a you know an interesting disorder. All cognitive disorders, you find that people share traits across all sorts of different types of conditions, and you know, you find that most people, you know, if you're weighted to one, you get a diagnosis, but you generally find people have little bits of all sorts of others. Little disclaimer, next bit is mostly anecdotal and there's very little science behind any of the following whatsoever. I mean, there's a little bit about me, really, that comes out beyond this, and it's me. Having ADHD is a personal experience. Someone described it to me, and I love this description, is having a load of TV switched on in your head. All of them are on different channels. All of them are on full volume. You have no idea which one you're supposed to be looking at. Someone else has control of the remote control and keeps changing them randomly. It really does feel like that a lot of the days. I spend a lot of time doing things like trying to deal with short-term memory by writing things on myself. I spend a lot of time writing because I can't lose myself. I'll lose the paper. So I am generally covered in all sorts of notes. The problem is I forget when I write reverse engineer dark patterns on my arm, what on earth I was thinking of at the time. You carry a lot with you if you have a cognitive condition, depending on your upbringing. I always find it's one of my favorite pictures of me sitting at the CIA Central Intelligence Agency table at CSUN. I was invited to sit there, and I said it's going to be funny for me because when I was a kid in the early 1970s, I'm 52. I was made to sit on a table that was called the thick table, which was for all children who struggled with reading or maths or concentration or anything. And literally, the teachers called it the thick table. Everyone called it the thick table, and that stuff stays with you for life, and you believe that that's where you should be sat. I learned coping strategies from a very young age because we had a wonderful school teacher who believed that we all should learn show tunes as children, and that was an important part of school. And the King and I actually taught me my first coping strategy aged about 5 or 6. And because I was a hugely anxious child, but incredibly hyperactive child, there were some wonderful lyrics that whenever I feel afraid, I hold my head erect. I whistle happy tunes so no one will suspect I'm afraid. And the end bit is the result of this deception is very strange to tell. For when I fool the people I fear, I fool myself as well. I was taught masking by the king and I don't know anyone else who's taught masking by the king and I, but I'm very good at it. And you cover it and everyone thinks you've got no problem and you move on. I was also taught focus by one of my babysitters, who used to look after me. He was actually the Chinese community leader in Manchester at the time, a chap called Lorette Lee, wonderful fella. And he used to bring bowls and buttons and chopsticks and a chocolate bar. And he said, sit there and move all those buttons from that bowl to that bowl. At the end, you can have the chocolate bar, but you've got to do it using the chopsticks. And I learned to use chopsticks, and I also learned to concentrate because I wanted that chocolate. Incredibly useful. I think he just did it just for a quiet life. And my mum also had this. She was an embroiderer in the 70s, and all of these threads that are on here were unpicked by me from industrial mop heads because we didn't have a great deal of money. That's where she bought her threads from, was from waste materials from factories. And I literally handpicked them all and arranged them all. Taught me a huge amount. As I said, no structure thing in life. I've been a sound engineer. I've done a fine art degree. I've been a life model, a machine operator, cleaner, seller manager, letting agent, artist studio manager, business development manager, art director, brand manager, TV radio producer, accessibility specialist, and a head of UX design. There's absolutely no plan in there whatsoever. It just, the next thing happens. And it's like that on every day. You know, you deal a lot with anxiety, you deal a lot with all sorts of other challenges around, and it becomes really difficult. And I find that when I talk to a lot of other people who have similar conditions, the anxiety is probably one of the biggest barriers for dealing, you know, with things on a daily basis. And imposter syndrome sets up. I actually found a better meme than this one of no idea what I was doing. Someone actually put up one the other day that just said, you're not important enough to have imposter syndrome. And I thought that is absolutely brilliant. I have a lot of fidget toys. This is one that I've got with me at the moment, which is a pebble I found on a beach that looks like a Barbara Hepworth sculpture. Love it. I've had it for years, and it's silent. It makes no noise, which is really good for meetings and presentations. And I have other ones that are very, very nice, noisy, like this wonderful cube that was given to me by a friend of mine in the Apple accessibility team when we were over in the States last. It's fantastic, but my word, it's very unpopular in meetings, so I don't bring it. I rarely finish anything. I'm a very good person at starting things, and I'm a very good person at finding problems. As one person on my team who's autistic recently pointed out, that I'm incredibly good at asking questions, and he's very good at answering them. And we work very well together in that way. But he said he would have nothing to answer if I didn't go around finding where all the questions are. So we work very, very well together. And my brain is obviously, you know, it's utterly obsessed or uninterested. And I have to, it's nothing that I have necessarily control over. It's just lucky that accessibility is an obsession of mine, and it's my day job. Compulsion I've already talked about, and this is with me. You know, I really am, you know, if something says don't do it, my brain's like already there going, go on, do it. And I find it very, very difficult to not do things. I think this is kind of partly, it was an interesting thing about the prison statistics, that when you actually look in, half of the things that, you know, most of the reasons those people are in there are very, very impulsive crimes. You know, how fast does this car go? How much can I drink? And it's like, and they get into all sorts of trouble. You know, we're not the best at planning. Also, I have a tendency of getting hugely distracted. I literally did once. Was late for a date with my now wife because I spent an hour staring at a wall. And when I don't want to do things, I will do them, but they generally go wrong. As this wonderful sculpture that was in it's in our local art gallery. There's a chap who goes around art galleries blindfold putting up shelves. Actually did a better job than I can do, because that's something that interests me at all. I'll have a go. I don't do it necessarily on purpose, but the lack of focus does struggle. Or I'll subvert. and I find ways around of going, well, that kind of works well enough for me. It's not necessarily where the rules are. But when I do get focused, like these paintings that I like doing, which I can do a whole hour talking about them, I will sit there and make hundreds of painted dots, if not thousands of painted dots on screen. So there's an interesting evolutionary theory about ADHD. Jonathan Williams, who's a clinical psychologist, came up with, which is all to do with actually its evolutionary advantage. It's not a disease. I'm not broken. I'm actually here for a purpose, and I really quite like this. And so this picture is a lot of nomadic people from the sort of Ice Age, probably, all sitting around the fire. And I've always thought they're asking, where's Gareth? Gareth is over there. Gareth went to find out being eaten by lions. He went to ask whether they were asking whether lions were friendly because they've never seen them before. Gareth found out, and they now know lions not friendly. It's you know, this is that whole thing. It's you know, you come across the berries in a bush and you don't know if they're poisonous. I've probably already eaten some as a kid. You know, it's like this is why we get into so much trouble. It's you know, you're questioning it, I'm already doing it. So, you know, as I've already pointed out, you know, we're very much I find divergent thinking is very much my skill. And I find working with people who are very good at convergent thinking, we work out. So I like finding barriers. I like understanding the questions and unpicking and pulling apart, because then that actually, when we come to do answers, we have more data and more information that will lead to better answers. So cognitive design is about, you know, I'm going to get into this a little bit, is about usability from a neuroscientific perspective, and cognitive accessibility is about barriers faced by people who are neurodivergent. They're two very different things, and there's a Venn diagram with dragons somewhere in the middle. But this is the area that I think I find most interesting. A few tips, instant tips and bits and pieces as well to think about. I find I get over stimulus wise because of my ADHD. There's a general tip with ADHD children is do not paint their bedrooms red or any other bright and heavy color. I had a bright orange bedroom with black and white striped everything. This was the 1970s. I hardly slept. It was just screaming at me, and it was no wonder I was bouncing off the walls. It's you know, it's so, and we've got one of our main buildings in the BBC, our news building, which I sometimes have to work in, obviously not at the moment with lockdown, but you know, the news branding is red, so everything is red, and I just sit there, I can't concentrate. I find the place awful. Signifiers and affordances are incredibly you know, important for me. You know, they've got to connect. You know, stop is green and go is red. I'll get massively confused because my associations pull round the other way. You know, you have to kind of stick with what, for someone like myself, you have to really stick with what is a convention for me to be able to understand it, and I learn those conventions and deal with them within a design sense. So, you know, you have a box with a name, and by the way, don't get me started on inline forms. I can't stand them because I've got no idea where I'm supposed to be filling anything in. Boxes is where you put information. But if it says name, I mean, literally my brain, I need to, like, whose name, what name, the name of what? And I start unpicking it. You know, I need a very specific instructions, because I am likely, because I've gone through all of the probabilities, is to pick the wrong one and talk myself out of it. I also, you know, flashing objects, massively problematic. There's the animations. One of the things at the BBC we've done is, you know, I'm actually not looking at the screen right now because I can't stop looking at that dot on the right. It really annoys me. One of the things at the BBC we've done to help ADHD children is on all our children's services, you know, lots of the websites and apps, they have moving backgrounds. We allow the child to freeze backgrounds and freeze animations and opt out of the motion. And reduce the motion. We did a similar thing at UView as well, as removing semi-opaque backgrounds from menus and all the other things, because it makes reading text and it makes focusing virtually impossible. But giving control to the user was so important. Another little thing around talk about is noise and targets. And so if you, when I was an art student, I got very much into Kazimir Malevich, Russian avant-garde artist, art theorist, early 20th century, probably responsible for the first ever abstract painting, but huge influence on non-objective minimalist art. But he'd basically say, if you want someone to look at a dot, put a dot down. Because as soon as you put 2 dots down, you've halved their attention. 3 dots, it's now, only a third as important. It's a quarter of important, and it just becomes harder and harder to remember what it is that you're supposed to be looking at. And this works in design, and the amount of interfaces that I see that remind me of the old Yahoo homepage, where it was just so full of dots, you've got no idea what it is that you're supposed to be doing. And that was always the lovely thing about Google. It's like, there's a button and a place I put a word in, and it gives me an answer. Such a simple thing. Robert Humans from YouTube gave a fantastic UX Live presentation called The Key Principles of Cognitive Design. And the talk introduced me to perceptual psychologist Dr. Anne Treisman, who studied human perception, and she discovered, or at least she identified the pop-out effect. Any search task is made easier if there's something unique about the target, something that will pop out of the display. The more unique the target is, the more it pops out. And so, where is the green square? And it's really, really, it's obvious here. There are squares, there are circles, but there's only one green square. It takes a moment because of the visual clutter, because of the greenness of the square. But when you ask where the green square is, within that, then and it's all just green, it becomes much more hidden. It's much harder to spot. And where you ask the green square again, where it is with this one, where it's just red circles within it, and there's only one green square, it's incredibly obvious. And so, looking at these kind of things, this is a really, really very, very, very basic, is if you've got a thing that you really need people to focus on, then think about helping them focus. So there's a mode that we built in on UView when we built, I was part of the product and design team that built the TV platform in the UK. Is there is a mode you can put on, so only the things that are in focus and related to the things that are in focus are the things down. And so you move to another thing, and then different things fall backwards to the background and stand out. And for someone like me who needs that kind of relationship and that pull between the two of them, that mode really helped me understand in complex menus what I was supposed to do and where I can go.
So, Gareth, to wrap up now, because
I am on my second to last slide.
That's good.
And so that was all I've got to say. Is that really, I've cut it right down from the original one, obviously for brevity. But a place that if you are interested in cognitive accessibility and the work that's happening, I would, obviously Jamie and I have been along as guests to the Cognitive Accessibility Working Group, W3C. There's some fabulous work coming out of that group. And they're drawing in from the whole of the industry to try and formalize some of the ideas and findings and data that's there into really good guidance. And I'm leaving the BBC fairly soon. And if you do want to follow me, I'm at Gareth FW on Twitter, and pretty much everywhere else I'm Gareth FW as well. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Gareth. Perfect. Very good timing. So brilliant presentation as always. And really, thanks a lot for.
It wasn't by design, pure chance that ended up on time.
Okay, I think this if you stop sharing, then we can let Sarah go in with the slides. So
I'm hoping.
Yeah. So I think this is was a very good way to sort of starting point to make sure that we all understand why this is so important, and really what cognitive accessibility is all about, at least from one perspective, because of course there are many other aspects of what cognition is, as Gareth also said. So in the project that Sarah is going to to show us the results of now. We have had a very broad perspective of cognition, and of course the neurodiversity is one path, but really I believe that this is important to all of us and in many different situations and contexts. So now I want to leave the floor to Sarah, who is leading our project on cognitive criteria. Please, Sarah.
It's always good to remember to unmute yourself. I was so already out of breath after Gareth's brilliant presentation that I'll try to just calm down and speak a bit slowly, because I'm also normally a very fast mover. Now it says that a co-host asked you to start your video. Thank you for that prompt as well. So I will try to do that. Good.
Yes, now we see you. It's
perfect. Good. Always nice with these technological prompts as well. Great. So
your presentation is in Keynote. So if you make it presentation mode, then it's shows better.
Oh, I see presentation mode. So that's very strange. How is that? Let's see.
If you just push the, yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And
so now it's perfect.
Strange. It was presentation mode from my side. Anyway, so here we go. Just a brief overview of what I'm going to talk about today. First, I would like to just follow up on Gareth's presentation about what it actually means. What is cognitive accessibility? And specifically when we talk about web. And then, of course, go into the research project to develop criteria for cognitive accessibility. And also, at the end, a few takeaways from this project. So just what is cognition about on the web? And we could do probably a couple of hours just talking about this, but just extremely briefly, cognition is about how we take in and gather information from the environment. So it's not only information. When we say information, we think maybe things we read or now that you're listening to me, but it's also all sorts of information. I mean, if you're sitting or standing, your senses is telling you whether you are comfortable. Maybe it's too cold, maybe it's too hot, maybe you have background noises somewhere, and all these things is constantly signaling to your brain that there is some information that you need to deal with, to understand, and also make a decision about if you need to do anything, and in that case, what. So if you have many sources of information and a lot of information coming in at the same time, there is a huge risk of cognitive overload. And the threshold for this is different for different people. I mean, if you have a cognitive disability, then usually your senses are heightened. So you will see the red more redder, or you will have the feeling that people are screaming at you, even though it may be low voices for somebody else. But it's also important to remember that cognitive overload can happen to anyone in stressful situations, and if there is a lot of information going on. Like for some people now, perhaps you are distracted by the sign interpretation. I certainly do my most not to look at that specific part of the screen where it's moving, because I know it will distract me. So this is kind of an interesting question when you talk about accessibility, because what is accessible and a help for some persons may also be a distraction for others. But in terms of websites and digital interfaces, what generally helps for most people is to have a clear structure where you can find the information easily and where there are few distractions. So all these flashing things that are moving, a lot of different elements in different parts of the websites, all of these sort of adds to a cognitive overload. But actually there is one sort of exception to this where additional information can be helpful. And that is when you have a text and an image, or let's say audio and text that says the same thing. So with multimodality, if you have several sources providing the same information, then it helps to get the message through to the brain, and it helps the understanding. Also, what is usually good for cognitively accessible websites is that you have some sort of help and support. So if you get stuck, you know what to do. Certainly it's common for a lot of people to feel a bit insecure on the web. What happens if I press this button? Will the computer explode, or will I get kicked off or out of the platform, or did I just buy something for 2 million euros? So if you have context relevant help and the clarity and structure, this is really helpful for most people, I would say. The thing is though, even though there are loads of recommendations on cognitive accessibility, few of these needs are actually covered in current legislation. And I'll let you think about this. It's sort of a cliffhanger. I mean, we have a theory about why this is the case, and we built a whole project around this theory. But just for a second, take a minute to reflect on why it's the case that even though so many people need cognitive accessibility, it's still not very well covered in the current standards and legislation. So of course, when we see a gap or a problem, we see an opportunity, the opportunity to do a new project. And so we saw this challenge to sort of do a project for more criteria on cognitive accessibility that can promote cognition into legislation and standards. So the challenge that we were looking at is specifically, how can criteria for cognitive accessibility be included in standards and legislation? So when you have a project, you need some ways to measure it. So how actually are we going about to do this? What's the success criteria for us? And we believe, and this is our theory about why it's not sufficiently covered in legislation, and that is that the key to success is to have the measurable criteria. There are a lot of recommendations in cognition, but one of the main criticisms against the recommendations has been that they are too broad. For example, it's good to have texts that are not too complicated. Well, okay, but what is a complicated text? I mean, does it depend on how many words you have, how complicated words there are, how long they are? It depends on the context. Is it academic? Who is the audience? So it's pretty difficult to say, is this text complicated, yes or no? And if you have standards and criteria that is for legislation, then there is somebody that needs to make sure that the rules, the law is actually upheld. And you need to be able to say, yes, this is correctly implemented, or no, the criteria has not been met. So you need a more binary kind of way of looking at it. And if you have, for example, in WCAG, there is a criteria that there needs to be alternative texts for pictures. So it's very easy to say, yes, there is an alternative text, or no. But the interesting part with this is that there is actually an element of judgment in it, because then you have to see, is the alternative text actually relevant? And that is not always the case. So what I would like to say with this is really that, yes, it's possible, we think, to do measurable criteria for cognition, but it's also not completely true that all the criteria for traditional web accessibility is completely binary. So we were lucky enough to find some funding for our idea. And we have a project financed by Vinnova, which is the Swedish innovation agency. And the specific aim of the project is then to convert recommendations that exist. So not to invent anything new, but really take recommendations on cognitive accessibility and transform them into measurable criteria. And in these kinds of projects, there are people that are smarter than us saying that, well, you can't actually change the world at first. I mean, you need to start small. You need to start with a specific sector. And it's, even though we like to think big, it's better to just try it in a smaller setting. And we did the pilot in the education sector. And the reason why we chose education is firstly because education is so hugely important for inclusion in society. Pupils that fall back in education have really difficulties to get included in later life. And also because at least in Sweden, there's been a push towards digitalization in the education sector. And this was even before the pandemic, actually. So what we have seen is that more and more teaching material, so textbooks, but also exams, so the national standardized exams are now going to be digital. And what happens if you're a pupil and you have a very specific cognitive impairment and you need to understand both what you're supposed to respond to, the actual question that you're responding to, and also understand the digital environment that may not be accessible, then you have higher chances of failure in the particular exam. And not because you don't know the things you're supposed to know, but because inaccessibility of the digital interface. So we also had another idea in the beginning. We thought that we could not really solve this whole issue sitting in an isolated chamber thinking big thinking. I mean, big thoughts, it doesn't really work. You have to talk to people and you have to make sure that the persons, both that are developing and designing and procuring digital interfaces, accept and can use the criteria, and also of course that they make sense, that they actually make a difference for the users. So in the project we have a core partnership of Funka, of the Swedish Standards Organization, the Agency for Special Needs Education in Sweden, as well as IAAP. And this is the core group doing the desktop research, developing the criteria. And then we have a group of pilots that are exactly the people working with digital interfaces, either developers, designers, but also procurers, so putting the demands on what kinds of digital interfaces you buy into schools. So we have a group of schools, national authorities, educational publishers, and content producers, testing and also reacting and consulting on the work and the criteria. And then we had a set of external stakeholders, which is international standards organizations and disabled persons organizations, who also used as a sounding board. I need to just have a sip. So the idea is that all the time we would do some work and then check if we're going in the right direction. So the methodology has very much been of consultation, both with the standardization, end users, stakeholders, and then also very much hands-on tests with users on prototypes of public digital services, and also prototypes of textbooks, teaching materials in the digital school environments. So we've been doing consultations and then developing and testing, and then going back and forth between those elements. So how did we come up with the criteria? Well, there are hundreds of recommendations, and what we did as a basis is to do a review of more than 50 sources of recommendations in different international standards, but also technical reports from the standardization committees, industry reports, non-profit recommendations from different types of organizations, and projects. And within each of these documents, there are perhaps 10 to 20 different guiding points, recommendations. So I would say we have looked at least 300-400 individual guiding points. So how would you choose? We can't make 300 measurable criteria. It would just be madness. So what we did was to look at which of the recommendations are overlapping. And there are quite a lot of recommendations going in the same direction. So we drew up a short list of the ones covering the user needs that are most often cited, like focus, for example, avoid distractions, these kind of things. And then we also had, through workshopping, testing, we tried to find which ones are the most measurable, which ones can we make the most binary. So you can actually say yes and no. Is the criteria fulfilled or is it not? So we ended up with criteria in 4 focus areas of needs. And the first one has to do with organization and structure of the website, so that it's clearly structured and it's easy to find information. Sorry about that. We also looked at focus. So is it easy to find the information and to stay focused on the task? And then orientation and navigation, which is it easy to see where you are on the website between the different pages? And is it easy if you are in the process of filling in a form, one of these forms that Gareth hates, where you are in the process and what you're supposed to be doing? And then the 4th area that we looked at is consistency. So for example, if you have one design element at one part of the site that, for example, activates an audio file, then if you have to activate an audio file in a different part of the website, it should be the same kind of design element that you choose, so that people can recognize and feel confident with, okay, this is what will happen if I push this button. And all the while we had in mind that we wanted to present this as the gift, the criteria we want to present as the gift for standards organizations. So we really had the focus on measurability, and we drew up a test methodology for each of the criteria, where you can follow different steps to see if the criteria has been fulfilled or not. And then we had a discussion around the formulation of the actual criteria, because all kinds of standards organizations use different ways of presenting their requirements. So the ISO way of doing it is not the W3C way of doing it, and not the ETSI way. And we didn't want to go into the whole discussion on how it should be formulated, if it's a standard way of doing it. So we have done a neutral formulation of the criteria itself that can then be transformed and adapted into the different standardization processes. So this is sort of the approach that we went for. And then when the criteria has been developed, of course, it's time to do the testing and the consultation part and all the iterations. So we have done a lot of user testing, more than 60 tests now, both in Sweden and abroad. And of course, we usually do quite a lot of on-site and focus groups, and we have been doing a few of these. But because a lot of the testing took place now during the pandemic, which is never ending, it seems, then we have been doing quite a lot of online testing. And what we did was to do prototypes where we implemented the criteria, and then the prototype of the same interface where the criteria has not been implemented. So we can see how this affects the users, if it is easier or not. I mean, what is the change when the criteria has been implemented or not? And we both developed generic interfaces like this generic tax agency. And we've also been working with the actual interfaces of our pilots. So the educational publishers and the national authorities that we've been working with within the project. We simply made copies of their interfaces with and without the criteria implemented. So we don't have the time now, unfortunately, to go into every one of the criteria. We have 5 to 7 candidates, and we're still in the process of selecting the ones that we really think are solid enough. But between 5 and 7 will be validated. And I will just show you one of the examples now, and it's the criteria called indication of progress in a visually described task. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means that if you have one of these forms that you need to fill out on the web, you will need as a user to know how many steps you need to complete, how much time will it take? And you will also need to know where you are in the process. And this should be visually described. So if we look at, for example, the prototype where it has not been, where the criteria has not been implemented, we have a form which is a tax agency. And at the top of the form, it simply says, add your details in below fields, and each step is a required field. It doesn't say how many fields you have to complete, and it doesn't say how long time it will take. And the first question is, how much is your income? And here a user has filled in 2,500 euro as the income, but it doesn't say how many questions there are. Is this the first question, the third, the fifth? I don't know. And it doesn't give you any feedback on whether or not the information has been correctly completed. And the next question is, how are you paid? And then the user has filled out, well, it's monthly. But the same again, there is no indication of which order the question is, and whether the completion has been accepted by the system, if it is okay. So if we look at the prototype where we have implemented the criteria, at the top, it now says that this form consists of 4 steps and that each step is a required field. I mean, to give, actually, what I would add to this is also to give an estimated time, but this is not in the criteria, it's just added bonus. If you want to make your users really happy, you should also do an estimation of how much time you need to do to complete the form. And for the first question, we have, and that is the question 1 out of 4, how much is your income? And now that the criteria has been completed, there is a tick off saying that, confirming that that it has been completed. And the second question, there's also numbering. So it's a question 2 out of 4, how are you paid? And there's also a checkbox showing that the person giving a confirmation that, and the answer that has been given, that is the monthly payment, has been accepted by system. And what you actually cannot see in this prototype is that before you fill it in, it's a white background. And now that it has been completed, it's also blue, so, which is an extra visual confirmation that the step has been filled out correctly. So the most interesting result, we are still looking through the results from the user testing, but what we found most interesting talking to end users and also to our pilots is that even what the people working in digital interfaces feel are very subtle design changes, they actually make a big difference for the users. So, I mean, we had the feedback of one of our pilots saying, well, I didn't know that just making the design elements more consistent would actually help them to find the information so quickly. And I think this is a key issue with cognition. Often, and perhaps especially if you don't yourself consider yourself to have a cognitive impairment, you don't see what the point is. Why is it so important to have the numbering? You can just imagine yourself, you can just yourself find out what the solution is. But this is not the way it works for persons with cognitive impairments, and it's not the way it works for any person under stress. Then what you see is what you get. You don't, as a user, you shouldn't have to be able to fill in the gaps yourself. So this is why even subtle design changes and prompts are very helpful. We also tested, of course, the review method. So to make sure that the testing methodology and the criteria is also both understandable and useful, relevant to persons working in digital interfaces. So here we have our pilots, which are stakeholders from private and public sectors, and they are now, this is actually still undergoing, but we are wrapping it up now, and it's they have been using the criteria and the review method to make a review on their own website, actually using the criteria to see if the text makes sense and if it's usable and relevant. And so far we haven't had any negative responses. So we take this as a validation that they have actually said that yes, we find the criteria relevant, useful, and also possible to implement. So just shortly, a very brief takeaways from this project is firstly that we believe we have now validated that cognitive user needs can be captured in measurable criteria, and that these criteria can be used in legislation. So there's really no excuse anymore, what we would say, if there ever were to exclude cognitive accessibility from legislative requirements. And then the second part is that we believe also that the method that we have been using in this project could be of use in other types of contexts. So this kind of collaborative effort where we do hands-on testing and development of criteria, and also consulting with stakeholders, with end users, and with everybody concerned. This process can also be used both in research and to complement processes of standardizations. So even though this is the end of the project, we really would like it to be a start of something new. So we are open for any ideas on how we can now use both the criteria and also the method and to put it to good use in other contexts. And I would also like to say that we will be doing a demonstration website where we have all the prototypes, all the criteria, all the test methodology, and this will be put online, free for everyone to use at the end of the project, which is in 1 month's time. So we're very busy putting all that together. But then please go on this website and have a look at the criteria and use them, even though they will not be legal requirements now. We hope that they will make themselves into standardization, but they will actually make a big difference to your users on the websites you are developing right now, straight away. So with that, I thank you for your attention. And yeah, it will be interesting to have the panel discussion.
Okay, thank you, Sarah. That was a very good presentation. And also, I think now everyone is very curious and eager to see the criteria, so really built up some expectation for that, which is of course good. So I would like to invite the panelists to put on their videos and the microphones also. If you don't have sleeping, snoring dogs in the background, then you can keep them off. So we have a very distinguished panel with us today to discuss cognitive accessibility. You are welcome to discuss the project as well, of course, but really we wanted you to sort of frame this and give another perspective also, because this is a national project with sort of international ambition, and we wanted to share our findings and also a little bit of discussion with the larger community around this. So with me today, I have Gareth Williams that you have already heard speaking, so I don't think I need to introduce him anymore. I also have Bart de Klerk from, I can't pronounce that.
BOSA, just
BOSA, yeah.
Federal Public Service, BOSA.
Yes. So anyway, I think the interesting part of that agency is that you are actually the monitoring agency for the Web Accessibility Directive. Yes. At least that is what I find most interesting about that agency. So you are in charge of everything there. And thank you for joining.
Well, not me personally, but yeah.
I think it's you. So thank you for joining us again with the short notice. And then, of course, Shadi Abuzara, how could we ever discuss anything without you on board? Also, I think everyone knows who you are, but the one and only person behind the W3C and everything that has to do with accessibility standards in the universe.
You're getting me in trouble now.
But
you and me both, Shadi.
So and then now I don't know what to say about Christian, but I guess your position is to be the responsible for everything that has to do with academy and research. So you will have to be the scientific person here and make sure that the other ones stay on track. Very good to have you here. And I know that your department and you and your team is doing an extremely good job with the research on cognition and also in all the other activities and projects that you're involved in. So thank you for joining us today. So my first question really goes back to what Sarah said, the cliffhanger. You should know she's also a writer, so she knows how to do cliffhangers. So, but now we have the sort of expert community here to help us out answering the question, why is it so that the accessibility standards, which are the presumed conformance for the directives and the legislation in Europe today, why are they covering physical disabilities much better than the cognitive? Does anyone know that, or can we at least have a discussion? I mean, why is this the case? Why do we need to have this discussion in the first place? Maybe Shadi, you're the standardization person here, so I'll let you go first.
Thank you, Susanna. First of all, after your introduction, I need to say that the working group does the work. I get to speak about it, so. Just so the credit of a lot of the work, of course, goes to the working group and all the active participants in that. The second thing is congratulations to you and to Sarah. This sounds like really, really fantastic work and much needed work to help inform further developments and continued development. Now, you had instructed me before to be short. I have about 5 or 6 post-it notes filled out with lots of reactions and comments. I will make it as brief as possible, and I'm really sorry, but this is such an important topic and so exciting, at least for me personally, that I think it really deserves a little bit of let me give a few things. First of all, I would like to say, I think way over 60% of the requirements in WCAG relate to people with cognitive and learning disabilities. Okay, there are requirements in there on headings, levels, instructions, consistency, content, moving content, background audio, timeouts, authentication, etc., etc. I'm not going to go through all of them because we don't have the time, right? Now, that doesn't mean that we're done or anywhere near. There's much more needed, and I think Gareth put it really well. You know, one person with a cognitive and learning disability, you only know one person, right? I think the field of cognitive accessibility is just so diverse and so individual that it needs much more, right? And we need to think much broader. And I like the thought of, we in the accessibility community always say accessibility pushes the boundaries and asks developers and designers to be more innovative. Maybe within the accessibility community, cognitive accessibility is what's pushing us to look for more innovative approaches and different ways of thinking about accessibility itself, because accessibility is not solved for any disability. I think Sarah mentioned that quite nicely. The text alternative is a great example of even how for blind people, we're far from having served their needs, right? All we say is provide a text alternative, but how good is a text alternative is a question that is still quite difficult to answer with the current standards. I'm being very open here, and I know I'm being recorded, right? That is the truth, that I don't think all disabilities are covered. We sometimes picture, that some disabilities are taken care of, others are not. I myself am quadriplegic, as you know, Suzanne. I think many of my requirements are not met. Just having big buttons that I can press, especially when I'm using a mobile device. This is something that, impacts me personally every day. So I think we need to move, raise the floor, push the borders, push the boundaries in accessibilities across the whole field. And I think we can learn a lot from accessibility, from cognitive accessibility. One thing that Sarah said is about measurability. And right now, the WCAG 2 model looks at measurability in a binary approach. Is it met or is it not met? One of the things that is being explored in WCAG 3 is maybe a scaled measure. And the analogy in my mind is, how big of a barrier is this? Right? And again, this applies to text alternative for blind people. It applies to me in the physical world when I'm thinking, okay, a very, very steep ramp or a broken elevator is for me an exclusion criteria. A little bit of a steep ramp is maybe less ideal, but maybe not excluding. So maybe we need to think more about a scaled approach, and that's actually what's happening in WCAG 3. So maybe new ways of thinking about how we can, as Sarah put it, formulate requirements, right? There isn't actually a W3C way of writing requirements. We are rethinking it in WCAG 3. It's an opportunity here where we can try to look at how to write requirements from scratch. And we really invite, you were asking what's the next step? Open invitation here to really come and help us do work. One last thing I want to put, and just so that I don't take too much time, I also want to talk about the technology stack, right? Not everything in society can be fixed with technology, but at the same time, also not everything in accessibility can be fixed with guidelines, right? There are different pieces that need to fit together. One is the guidelines themselves, and what can we put as guidelines, as requirements. But what other content, what other technological advances can we use? Now, one of the things about cognitive and learning disabilities is it's so individual, as I said earlier. And there's work at W3C on, for example, personalization. So being able to personalize websites even more to a larger degree, right? We see that things are really, really highly personal. For example, the red background that Gareth was using, which is maybe comfortable for him to highlight something. No, okay, you were using that red a lot. Yeah, for me, that was exactly the same reaction. But anyway, the point is,
it kept me going.
Okay. Maybe Susanna should put a red slide now for me so I can stop. No, but the point is, I think we know this, that we need to have more possibilities of personalizing the content, because even what is easy to read or what is text will be very different from one person to the other, and maybe we need here mechanisms. This brings me to the third point, which is also new technologies, tooling, both in the authoring side, natural language processing and grammar tools and things that help authors author proper content, but also on the user side, things to help use the text or use the content more easily. One really, really last point, Susanna.
I need to stop you because you still didn't answer the question. So my question was, why is it that the regulations are not covering cognitive better? So you challenge that by saying WCAG is already about cognition. So the I don't know how to put this in English, but the premises for the question is wrong.
No. I was challenging the comparison that for certain types of disabilities it's good and for others it's not. I want to say it's bad for a lot of people.
Okay,
and
fine.
yeah,
That's
so to answer your question, I think Greg van der Heijden put it in a good way, which I think he was citing Clayton Lewis in saying we haven't figured out ways of writing these requirements well enough yet. And for example, the requirement that Sarah proposed about providing the steps in a form which sounds really logical and really good. There were already people in the chat challenging that sometimes the process is not one-dimensional and you know the exact steps along the way, but it's multi-dimensional. You actually cannot say how many steps will be there. So this is part of developing the requirements in a broad environment. For developing standards like WCAG, we literally get thousands of comments that we address because it needs to be broadly applicable to many kinds of websites in many situations. So it's hard work. That's the answer to your question. We haven't figured out yet a way of putting these requirements. And another part is sometimes we don't know the user needs. Such research work like you're doing and others, that's what's needed to help inform what's needed. And then we need to figure out a way to put it in broadly applicable standards.
Thank you. When you are now taking a breath, I will leave the floor to someone else to speak. Thank you, Shadi. There was really good, a lot of good stuff. I know you can talk about this for 2 hours, but it's supposed to be a panel. I need to move on to someone else. Yeah. So Gareth, you are very, very, very polite and raise your hand. So I need to give the floor to you, but I won't let you speak as long as Shadi did because you already had your 15 minutes. So, but what was your comment?
Oh my God, yeah. The last thing you want is to leave me on. I'll go on for forever. I can talk for England. So I think there's a whole bunch of stuff that Shadi brought up there, and I think there's a very important point that about the barriers is that often we don't have the data to define the barriers possibly enough. We're all solutions people. We work in accessibility and we want to fix things, and we try to go to solutions before we understand the problems. And this is sometimes, particularly in this area, we don't have the data, and people mix up anecdote with data, and we end up with bad solutions. And there's a lot of that in particularly around cognitive accessibility, which is why we have all these dreadful fonts that don't actually do anything for anyone, and there's no data to support them. You know, that's a real massive bugbear of mine. It's like, give me the data, show me this is even real. And it's like, well, my mate Colin quite liked it, and it's like, that's not data, that's not evidence. And so there's huge problems. I want to quote someone. Some of you will know Dieter Rams, a brilliant product designer who's still around, still with us, influenced obviously, Jonathan Ives to build, to design everything that he designed for Apple. And, he designed Braun products. And he said the one and only cardinal sin in design is not designing for the reality in which people live. And I think cognitive accessibility sits within that reality because it's partly to do with condition, as a lot of accessibility does in other places, partly to do with condition, but it's also environment and situation. We don't live in labs. And this is why lab testing is always a little bit problematic with this. But there's my daughter who's a UX designer asked me once about cognitive accessibility. And she said, do you have any data from anywhere like Uber? Because after 10 o'clock at night, everyone who's using Uber is cognitively disabled. We're either exhausted, we're tired, or other. And so then they must have some research around this because their entire user base is hitting within this group. And I actually approached them and they didn't have anything. That was quite a number of years ago. But I've noticed it's interesting that some of those types of apps that are dealing around time do things like increase target sizes late at night because they're expecting people to become situationally and environmentally disabled. And so we're still understanding this at the time. If you're in a conversation with someone and you're distracted, you're cognitively disabled at that point. There's all sorts of situations around this. So unpicking this, pulling data together behind it and bring those contexts into this amazing work that you're doing and is happening in the COGA working group we've been doing a bit and pieces, and having those communities bring this together, I think we'll unpack this. But I think the reason it's not been done, mixture of data, and it's also history. You know, I mean, I'm just about to leave the BBC, but I've been part of an accessibility program that's 85 years old, and it's only just started dealing with this. And, you know, we started trying to design wirelesses for the blind in the 1940s and doing the first InVision signing in the 1957 for TV, because that's the way it built up. And it's a historical growth of accessibility within media and content delivery. And we're now at this stage where we can actually start having these conversations.
So thank you, Gareth. I think you're now building the business case for cognitive accessibility with the Uber reference. So that's really good. So if data is, we lack the data. So Christian, you're in the research field. Why don't we have the data on this? If that is the case, just as because that is what I'm trying to pull out of this long answers I get. We don't know. So is that true? We don't know about enough.
We don't know enough, but I mean, coming back to your question, you'd start a little bit earlier on, because in my opinion, one of the big reasons is that people with cognitive problems have not as strongly raised their voices as other user groups did. Maybe they couldn't do it or whatever, but in practical, they and their requirements haven't been realized for long. In the public, and that is still, I mean, from my perspective, they have just, you know, didn't merely exist in the conscious of the general public. And then it comes secondly, the role of the intermediaries of saying, oh, they are not for the internet. This is so complicated. And the second thing is, oh, that is too dangerous for them, letting them in. And that's just, you know, cyberspace is closed for these people. And one thing has been said, again, for the reasons why we don't have it, it is easy to, you know, to check whether this box is there or not, or the alternative text, as you said, but it's much more difficult to talk about understanding. Is this really understandable? Who can understand what? And this makes it so difficult to come up with testable, reliable criteria to say what is understandable. And then, you know, one person rather than a complete group. It's so heterogeneous, and that's the reasons behind that. So we need more data, and we need more exploration. I'm very interested in to see your criteria. I'm not completely convinced whether the criteria like you presented it will completely solve the problem, but it might be a very good step in going into the right direction.
I don't think that our aim was to solve all problems at least, but try to show that there are problems that can be fixed, just to challenge the idea that this is so difficult. But if we go to the public sector, I mean, we have tried to test this with the end user, of course, and then the public sector bodies who are maybe would be covered by legislation if this or other cognitive criteria ever reaches the standards. And then, and of course, the ICT suppliers who also need to implement this. We have tried to talk to everyone to see if this is sort of doable or not. So we have the public sector here with us, with Bart.
Yeah.
What's your take on this?
Well, basically, I'm glad this is called a panel and not a debate, because I don't really have all that much to. I think a lot of that's been said by all three of you. It's correct. There's some history behind it. There are, and I in my own notes, I said there are quite a few WCAG criteria which are relating to cognition already, like Shadi said. At the same time, I think one of the things that does cause problems is that it's in general, and it's still a simplification, but it's easier for a non-disabled person to imagine physical disabilities. As a simplification, obviously, you can close your eyes and be blind. You can turn off the sound and you're deaf. You can change some screen settings to reduce your contrast. You can navigate through a keyboard to not be able to manipulate a mouse. It's an oversimplification, but it's a real one. It's virtually impossible to pretend to have a cognitive disability and make any conclusions about that. I can't, in my head, become Gareth. I can't feel what he feels. I can't... but I can do roughly, very roughly, that for a blind. Yeah, okay. I can do that for a blind person. I can try using a computer with my eyes closed. It's an imperfect comparison. It's always an imperfect comparison, but it's a lot closer than I can get with cognitive disabilities. This makes it.
But you could, I mean, following Gareth's idea, you can get drunk.
Yeah, but like he said, you meet one cognitive disabled person and you meet a second one, and it's completely different. Drunk, at least there are the advantages. It's pretty similar across the board, but it's just one. It's the equivalent of meeting one particular disabled person, cognitive disabled person.
I think we should get together and test this out.
Yeah,
this theory.
Sounds like a very good plan.
Post-COVID,
yeah,
I think we need to get funding.
So I think it's harder to capture the accessibility features required in easy rules, in part because it's very hard to empathize with cognitive disability, because you can't in your head become that person. And I'm not saying I can become a blind person simply by closing my eyes. I mean, there are a lot of types of blindness. You have people who are blind from birth, people who became blind. So it's not the same, but it's a lot closer than I can get to a cognitive disability. And that makes it, I think, harder to imagine those rules, to figure out those rules. And I think also at the same time, the cognitive disability might in itself make it harder for that cognitive disabled person to themselves suggest the rules that would apply. So it's an issue on both sides, and I think that makes it harder to get those criteria, to get those standards, which in consequence also means that they are less likely to be included in a comprehensive manner. And I think that's part of the reason. And history, absolutely, Gareth nailed it there. I mean, even WCAG and such. WCAG 1 already included cognitive criteria, but I think that the initial initiatives certainly were from the point of view of blind. The point of view is a strange expression there, but from blind people and such.
I'm sorry, I want to challenge that. I mean, that was my first point, because I'm really feeling nervous, this kind of segregation and saying, you know, here are people with disabilities and here are people with cognitive and learning disabilities. I don't think that's a useful approach. I do really subscribe to the, you know, universal design, inclusive design, call it whatever term you want. People with cognitive and learning disabilities very often have neurological and motor disabilities, and you know have certain and vice versa, have visual disabilities. Kind of, I think we need to see humans on a spectrum of abilities with different degrees, and trying to look at approaches that will fit everything together. I think this kind of separation and saying this group, you know, is more or less or something. I mean, there's definitely things to it in terms of involving people with disabilities, and I think, but this applies to the whole community. You know, nothing about us without us as a disability community. I think most of my quadriplegic friends have no idea about technology and would not be able to formulate any requirements. But how do we involve people with disabilities in the design of requirements and standards? And I think, as Gareth put it, you know, give me the data. We need the data. We need more research in the field to better understand the actual requirements, and then to formulate them in a way that is measurable. And here, measurable doesn't have to be binary. That's what the group is exploring.
Don't get me wrong, actually. I was looking at it historically. I mean,
right.
It's true that especially what Gareth said 85 years ago, cognitive disability was not considered, I guess, for most people, a disability.
It was.
Can we?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So
we were a radio company.
That
was
It's all very, very interesting. Sarah, do you want to comment on this? Because I think it's quite interesting that we have these people that I really respect and think very highly of, and still it's really and also in the chat you can see very clearly that people are very stuck in what they think. So I think what we maybe can do with this project result is really to stir the pot a bit and maybe challenge some of these views, because I think that is that was our aim, and hopefully we will continue with that. But do you want to comment on all these clever things?
Actually, two things about these individual approaches. I think that everyone is different. So I'm not buying the argument that because there are so many different people that have different kinds of cognitive issues and that nobody is the same within the spectrum, then it becomes much more difficult to do anything. I think what we have seen in this project, and what certainly was an eye-opener for me, is that there are many common needs as well. And no, we're not going to solve everything, but let's not that become a barrier for not doing anything. So what we try to do, I mean, we looked at 400 or 500 recommendations, and we saw that, okay, this doesn't fit in to the binary. I'm really happy, Shadi, that you said that it doesn't have to be binary, because this is really an area for us to explore. But also, no, we cannot solve everything for everyone. And this is actually what we have been seeing in the projects we are doing. We have been doing this project, which is trying to solve some issues that are common for most people, or for a lot of people. And then we have a different research project where we have been working on personalization, which is also very important for some people with cognitive disabilities. But I'm not really buying this argument that because cognition is so broad and everyone is so different, we cannot make standards out of it. I mean,
so
can we try to not have this like a big debate about small things? I just want everyone to be able to to say what they think, and I think we can agree to disagree, or maybe it's a question of not having the time to discuss it enough, because I know we're also in agreement on many things, and it's sometimes terminology and things like that and perspectives, but I think most of us at least think that it's we need to have more data, and it would be good if we could also try to overcome this and solve the gaps. And I'm sure that this project will not be solving everything, but hopefully we can start somewhere and do something. And I know, of course, there's a lot of other good work going on in many different places, and let's just try to work together to see if we can move forward on this, because I think we also see that many people are really engaged in this and want to solve it. So my timing for this has gone absolutely it's not working anymore. So that's a good thing, because many people have lots to say. But let me just try to end the panel discussion with a more positive and forward-leaning questions, so that we don't get stuck in the sort of in the past and in the problems, because I really like to be, we always pride ourselves with being the solution people. So so Bart, what can we do to overcome? I mean, I call it a gap. Shadi doesn't want to call it a gap, but we can call it something.
Well,
we know
it's a gap. It's not the only gap that exists, but it's a gap. Let's put it that way. But it's not a gap between the current rule set and that group. It's more of a gap, an absolute gap. I think more attention and publication of user testing with such users and testing with the kind of work you're going to do with the website in a month, that can help in coordination with field expert scientists, because of that empathy issue. I think that can help raise awareness at the theoretical and the practical level, and specific pushes to help raise the discourse on that. And I think WCAG is a really, or the W3C is a key place to do that, because when I look at Europe, at least, for the detail of the policy work, so the practical implementation, everything looks back to WCAG. The EU norm and the Web Accessibility Directive, for example, in the end, it all comes down to referring to WCAG for the accessibility criteria defined therein, and try to follow up on those as a cornerstone, as the cornerstone of the whole rules and regulation thing. So if you can work into that, that is key long-term, I think, for enhancing accessibility for everybody. It's in a way, it's a dull thing. I think it's the guidelines and advice and so on is very useful, but it is only really useful for people who are already motivated to do it, which hopefully is a big and growing group. but there will always be a big and significant group who will only be pushed forward through rules and regulations, and who will need that anchor of things like the WCAG criteria or something similar to advance significantly.
Yeah, well, that's definitely true. I mean, to get the volume of this, or the sort of scaling up, you need the legal part. I agree with you. But if we could make, so we have a change of sign language interpreter. Here we are. So if we could make the larger community to understand that what we today call cognitive criteria, whatever that is sort of useful for everyone and helpful and so on, would it be, do you think, just from a public sector agency perspective, would it be possible if that was sort of common knowledge, even if it wasn't legislated, if people understood that making the website easier or the service easier for these target audiences would actually make it sort of faster, more efficient, and better for everyone? Because I think this is really sort of to combine what you're saying with empathy.
It would, but if we're talking about an actual gap and how big of an impact you can have, I think the actual impact of that will on the whole be much smaller at that level than having it feed back into rules and regulations. Sometimes it makes me sad to have to say things like that, because I'm personally motivated and I'm personally very interested in going beyond the rule sets, and in all my communications with we're the monitoring body, and I frequently get questions about, well, if we do it like this, is that okay then? And often my answer is, well, technically you will then be following the rules, but, and then I give a lot of arguments on why you should try to be better than that, to not just follow the letter of the law, but to try to actually approach accessibility as I want to make this accessible to people, not I want to be conformant to this or that criterion. But I have no real levers to force them to do that. And if they have to choose people, a lot of people will choose the easy way out.
Yeah, my logic to this question was just, or behind it was just that if the problem is that we don't have the data and we don't have the knowledge, if somebody, the society, could provide that data, if it was kind of a common knowledge, not only in the legislation, not only in a standard that you need, I agree that you need to be specifically interested in accessibility to get, but if it was sort of common knowledge that this is how you do it, because we know that the logo is usually up to the left and the footer is, I mean, there are some sort of really not standards, but standardized ways of doing it.
Informal standards.
Hey, you know, this is one of these big problems, and we're building things on, you know, on operating systems where they put a start button in for shutting it down, you know, and so you find, you know, there are huge cognitive problems. Even I can't tell you how long the first time I got a Windows machine, I think it was 3 hours before I've actually just pulled the plug out the wall because I couldn't work out to switch it off. Going back in the day, it just made no sense. But I think this is the problem. It's a mixture. I totally agree, you know, with everything that everyone said. There's some really good points in here, but you know, it's going beyond. Guidelines are a really good starting point, and they're a good place to think, and they're kind of a foundation thing, and they're a foundation that's a work in progress because they're constantly evolving, changing. We're adding new data in, they're growing, and there's a discussion around them, and they stimulate discussion. It's not just about compliance. I always like to say compliance is not an answer to any other question except, is it compliant? You've got to stick the user at the front of it. You know, these are user experience designers that are building these. If they don't understand the user, they're never going to be able to build an experience that will work for it. And as Jamie always likes to say, and I'll bring Jamie into the, you know, we sit in UX&D within BBC for accessibility because nothing is inaccessible until we design and build it. We create disability through our choices that we make as designers. And that is where the problem is. We have a nice little technique that we like to sometimes use is at the beginning of a project, say, who are we willing to exclude? Make a list and don't add to that list in any of the choices that you make. And if you do, go back and make a different decision. It's a really neat way of doing it, but this is a design problem. And it's about, you know, thinking about the fact that people are complicated, our environments are complicated, our situations are complicated, designed for those complexity, exactly what Dieter Rams was talking about. And I think he said that in the early 1970s. You know, he totally got it. It's
I think
people.
the same thing actually holds. You can expand the reasoning. I mean, we need to design our rules and regulations for that as well, because people, it's very similar. I mean, if you know that many people will only do what's regulated, then you need to design your regulations in such a way that it stimulates the people to do the right thing.
Yeah.
And that's also hard.
Yeah.
Yes.
Making standards and regulations accessible. That's a whole other topic, but but I agree with you.
Can you do a session on that?
Yeah, what I pick up from you, Gareth, is that we need to educate people. So at least, and I would like to sort of focus on educating the people who are at university now or soon, so that at least the next generation gets to have this in their blood and DNA. So that's one answer at least. And Christian, I know you have been working a lot with engaging and involving end users in research. So can you say something about how that works? And I mean that, because that is, I think, also something that has been picked up, that these target audiences are rarely in standardization and are rarely in sort of product development and research and so on. So could you say something about that?
Okay, I just want to say something from the chat, and because that's very true. I mean, what we need is of more, as I said, organized advocacy for this work and for that what we want to achieve. If it comes to research, data collecting, and whatever it is, and also technical developments, it is indeed also a challenge to bring researchers together from the technology side, from the computer science and whatever it is, and also from people with disabilities side, in particular if it comes to cognitive problems. There's a very little understanding between these two groups, and it is an effort for everyone involved to do it. But we have done it in several projects, and we come up with the, let me say, the experience that in the end, we learned a lot from the users, which we didn't expect. One of the examples I can make is, we made a very, very simple interface. We really thought it's very simple. We made it, but the people required it even more simple. I never thought about it. I said that was boring. And actually, if you work with it for a long time, it will be boring. So you have to have something, upgrading something. But we never went down to such a simple solution as they required. We never had made this experience or the finding without talking to the people very closely in the process, because we were in the end not, here's now the design and try to evaluate it, but we were just in the beginning, and they could intervene and say, no, this is much too complicated. And this is something we need to work on methods. I mean, we have done a project where we had tried to develop methods and apply methods how to do this better. I'm not saying we have found, the golden key, but I think we have to work in this direction even more, because particularly in this area, and it's, all the users themselves, they know what they need. And I come back to the point of the personalization. I still believe that this is a very important issue which we have to work on. And finally, also to technology, because I mean, standards and regulation, everything's fine, but working in this field for some years now, I say the technology is changing so rapidly, and is, providing us new opportunities to overcome current problems. Like, if you use AI machines for translations and so on, we are not yet there, but we have to take this, as a vision and work on it. And so we have the side of the rules and the regulations on one hand, but on the other side is, make the best of the technology we have and take the best technology we have as far as we can.
Yeah, and then, so I agree with you. And then also the technological development is also as such making troubles, because we need to learn a lot about new things all the time. So at least I feel very, very tired sometimes when things get updated and and changed. I guess that's a sign of age. So let's not talk about that. I will let you have 30 seconds to say something really clever, Shadi. If you want to be positive.
something,
yes.
something clever.
Yes. If the answer is everyone should join W3C and standardization is answer to everything, then your time is up. But if you have another sort of angle on the how do we solve this, or how do we improve the situation, forward leaning?
So yeah, I mean, definitely in involving people with disabilities, people with cognitive and learning disabilities, working with them. If my earlier comments were in any way understood that, you know, it's enough and we don't need to do more, that's not the point. W3C has been really investing a lot in this, and this is since WCAG 1, this has been a focus area, and we need to do much more, and not only us, but the whole community. So I agree with all this. And the other aspect in addition is, you know, these requirements, there is no free lunch, and it is something that is hard to do. It doesn't mean we should give up, or there's not, we shouldn't do it, we shouldn't continue trying, but it has to stand up. It has to be stuff that can be applied on different kinds of websites in practice and so on. And this is where W3C brings these different stakeholders together, industry partners, researchers, people with disabilities, etc., to kind of really try to shake these out. It's a very rigorous process in order to find requirements at the end that really are broadly applicable. Yes, Susanna, this is the invitation.
Thank you, Shadi. I think we've been through this before. Always good to have you on the panel. So, Sarah, do you have any closing words before we open up for the questions from the audience? So, how do we go from here? I know we have loads of ideas of new projects and so on. So, I don't require you to detail that, but just to sort of, what's your view on now this being the sort of first step? So, what would you like to see in the future?
I think this is actually something that we agree on, that we need to speak more across different sectors and between, and involve the users in any way we can. And I'm thinking also about the educational part. We are involved in other projects where we are trying to get web accessibility into ICT education. And this is really about the culture change that people are talking about in the chat. It's not only cognitive accessibility, but really to get persons working professionally with digital interfaces to understand that there is actually a user who's going to use it from their perspective, not from what is most interesting in the engineering or design or whatever background you have yourself. So yeah, more collaboration and more sort of, let's talk more to each other. I think that will make the world a better place.
Yeah, definitely. And also I would add to talk to others, because sometimes, I mean, it's no matter how much I enjoy talking with this group, we do know each other. And even if we can discuss these things, we know that this is important and we work for it. And the most challenging thing is to reach the others. So if every one of us leaves this webinar today and then go start talking to 2 or 3 people that are not yet convinced, then this will spread in a better way. So thank you very much. We do have some specific questions from the audience, and I may have missed some in the chat because it's so much going on, but very happy to see that there's a live discussion going on the side of the panel as well. But it's just that is a little bit too difficult for me from a cognitive perspective to think that I can do 2 things at once, which is listen and read, and also sometimes speak. I do sometimes believe I can do it, but I know I can't. So this is a question for Sarah. Were any of the user tests done in Finland?
I don't have all the, I don't think so, but if you have a user group in Finland, please contact us so we can do more tests.
I know we were in contact with 2 of the disability organizations that we are usually working with in Finland, but I don't know if they were going to participate, because we had some tests in Swedish and then we did tests in English. And we are also doing German tests, I know, or tests in German, but we haven't had the resources to do all to translate to all different EU or all the world's languages. Unfortunately, we don't have that big a project, but very good question. And we're always happy to reach out to Finland. So, but it needs to be people who can do the tests in either Swedish and and or English, but please do reach out. And then we have another question for Sarah. How many criteria have been developed that are defined and measurable, and where can we find them?
So we are still validating the final ones. I mean, the project is ending end of April, and we have 7 criteria where we have test methodologies and where we are doing the tests. It could be that 1 or 2 of them will fall out in the end of the user testing. We are building this demonstration website as well that will be available in April. And we need to find a way to get this information out to everyone who attended this. But there will be a link from the project website, and we will also make a lot of promotion on that.
And I guess that will also stir up some dust, and I'm sure we will have a lot of comments and ideas when we do publish this. So please welcome, we're always welcoming more comments and questions and so on. So I think even if that will be the end of this project, hopefully it will also be the start of something new. So another question for Sarah, can you give an idea of how much of these 50 recommendations you think could be made into measurable requirements, and how much of it has been covered in the project?
I mean, it's a tiny percentage that has been covered in the project, and it's really difficult because a lot of the recommendations that we looked at, this was really year 1 of the project, so it's a few years back, and I don't have that good memory. So how much would be measurable? Well, I guess it depends on how you put the definition of measurable. If we just keep to the binary, then we have this smaller segment. But if we go into Shadi's direction here, and they have a different approach of how we define what measurable is, then it could be larger. So I don't really dare to put a percentage of this, but my feeling is that it's more than we think. In fact, a lot of the things that we have been having a lot of discussions around in the project is about text, because understanding is usually what we're trying to understand is textual information, and easy to read is one of the things that regularly comes back, and it's noted from being difficult to be measurable. But I still believe that it can be, even in some cases, can be defined as measurable as well. So the sky is the limit, I would say, without giving any any commitment to actually doing it. But yeah, this is to see how much could be measurable is a completely new project.
But just to give a little bit of context, maybe we did the literature review and then the mapping, and then we tried to group recommendations that sort of are similar to each other. So I think we may be able to say something about the groups when we end the projects, at least.
Yeah, well, with the short list from which we selected the 7 criteria to work on is about 55, yeah, around 50 requirements, and they were grouped into 8 areas. So in addition to the 4 we actually had text, and we had help functions as well, where there is a WCAG criteria, a level AAA that we want to push up to AA. So yeah, I would say if we look at those, the short list is it's around 50 criteria that we looked at out of the 300-400 on the original list.
And then we have a question that may be for everyone or for Shadi. Why are we still at the first step with so many things in accessibility after having WCAG for over 20 years? Are people who purchase web properties just not aware, and we need billboards and TV spots? Do we need to sponsor a football team like UNICEF does? That's a really good question. Does anyone want to answer that or reflect on it? The football team.
I think to expect us to be any further than we are in our understanding and what we're delivering is a difficult thing, because it's a constantly moving feast. You know, I always say that my job would be really easy if people stopped inventing things. And this is the problem. Innovation is continuously happening. There are constantly new ideas, and we're working and we're trying to move with that and trying to actually create this context of universality around it. And so W3C is staying in pace and trying to understand that, and it constantly opens up, and new contexts and new products and new, all sorts of things happening. And when you're trying to be universal and agnostic in what W3C is, it's an enormous challenge. You've got to look at what they're trying to do. It's huge. And so, this is it. It's keeping pace with change is the reason why it's constantly being refreshed and discussed and explored. And we're learning more about ourselves, not just about technologies. There wasn't screening in mainstream schools until, relatively recently for things like ADHD. And even ADHD, we're not quite sure whether that's one thing or many things that all have a kind of shared characteristic. We're still understanding the conditions. And so, it's extraordinary. I mean, I've only worked in accessibility for about 17 years or something like that. And the change that's happened just in that period of time has been phenomenal, in the way that we've come forward. But it's an extraordinary thing. But yeah, it's a constantly moving thing. And it's so, that's the challenge in it. And you're always working in a framework of other people's ideas and technology.
Yeah, very true. Very true. Shadi.
Want to add, if I may, yeah. I mean, even though I'm a technologist and standardization, workforce standardization, I think accessibility is changing society much more than the technologies or the standards and so on. I think that's really something that we shouldn't forget. I see the future as more inclusive, more diverse, and I think we're just at the beginning, and there are many invisible disabilities or conditions. We didn't even talk about behavioral disabilities and other things. I mean, there's still a lot more to do and a lot more. Whether it's the first step or a little bit of baby steps that we have accomplished, that's a matter of perspective, but there's definitely much more still to do.
Yeah. Christian, do you have any thoughts on why we are not moving faster?
Yeah. We have a fast-moving target, and as you know from rocket science, we get this dog curve, and that's what happens here. We are always running behind. If we would find a mechanism to get up front, and I remember things, when I started in this area working, we were trying to make public telephones accessible. We have no public telephones anymore, but we're still running behind the new kind of things we have now. That's what's happening, getting up front, and maybe more general criteria like the principles and so on. These are things, which if we can foster more on that and say, kind of think about this before you do something, that could be maybe a way to get closer, getting up front rather than running behind.
Bart, do you have a view on why we're still running behind?
We'll always be running behind. It'll never be enough. It'll never be fast enough. It'll never go far enough. In 100 years we'll be having the same discussion, which is not a motivation for giving up. It's an arms race.
Oh, you muted yourself.
Yeah, I muted myself. Where we are today on the web, in many ways, is way, way better than where we were 10 years ago. I think nobody can deny it. But we have a very long way to go, and we have to make sure that we don't regress, because the regression is a real risk, because technologies change, evolve. New technologies don't necessarily provide more but better accessibility than the past. But if we can infuse an accessibility culture, and I think I was following the discussion thread, and I think that's part of it, is we need to advance, and there are many methods and many mechanisms to do that. Regulations obviously is one of them. Data, and I think going back to the cognitive disabilities discussion, or I think data is indeed key. Data, references, examples, good practices will bring us forward, but it's an illusion to think that we'll ever get a fully accessible web even for government websites where it's legally mandated now in Europe, it's an illusion. But if chasing that illusion gets us to a much higher level of accessibility on the whole, then that chasing that illusion is a good thing.
Yeah, I'm always, I mean, we always wonder every year when we are planning our training sessions, we are asking ourselves, how come we still need to do the introduction on accessibility after 20 years? Why
we'll still need to do it in 20 years.
Yeah, and another 100
yeah.
years, as you say. But I mean, I think, I mean, I also see really that things have changed, and I think more about society and people's behavior and how people with disabilities are sort of approached in society, that really has changed during my lifetime as well, or at least. But I'm actually with Eric Eggert here, who posed the question, that I'm surprised that it doesn't move faster. I realize technology is moving faster, and we will always be behind in a technological way. But I'm still wondering how it is that the society at large doesn't understand that accessibility is needed, or that people are diverse. I mean, how come we still need to discuss that? That is really, to me, very strange.
That's a huge one. I mean, again, you can look at everything from the education system to all sorts of, there's so many societal factors for that.
Yeah.
You know, when I grew up, there were no disabled children in mainstream schools, in mainstream education. It just didn't happen. And there, you know, and so people grew up not knowing other people. And of course, that creates problems further down the line. Yeah. I was kind of lucky because I actually grew up on a flat above a residential disabled school in South Manchester that took on all of the disabled kids that the other special needs schools couldn't deal with. And they were my friends that I played with every day after school, you know, and they, you know, we lived together. It was a big family thing. I had that, and I see that as a privilege. But I see myself as a bit odd in that respect, because I know so many people in my generation who have had no experience, and therefore they really struggle to abstractly think and deal with it. And then it's not that they don't want to. That was taken away from them when they were young, because society is changing, and we will see this generationally start working itself out. I think, as Shadi said, you know, society is changing, and this is changing society. You know, it's so important.
Yeah. Susanna, can I try to turn this into a positive so that we can end with the happier note? This is depressing me. So, yeah, there's still racism, homophobism, you know, in society, even though people have been trying to combat that also for, you know, thousands of years. And so, yeah, we could say this will always be. But one thing that keeps me going is thinking, what if we didn't do this work? How would the web then look like, or how would technology look like? So, yeah, so I think, you know, we need to continue working on this, and you know, technologies keep coming, the challenges keep pouring in, but let's try to keep, you know, working at that.
Yep, true. So we have many interesting questions and a lot of things going on in the chat, but we will need to wrap up. And I promise you we will answer all the questions we can in writing after this session, today or next week when we have the time. So we have got questions around the user testing insights and so on. There will be a lot of information about this in the project reports, of course, and in the website where we will provide all the results of the project. So I'm really happy we had this discussion. It has been going all over the place, and which is always nice. And I think that is the good thing with having good panelists that sort of move the topic from my initial ideas to something else. But I wanted to let Sarah have the final words. If you have any concluding things on this. I don't want to push you in any direction. Well, I mean, just give you the floor.
I would always, even though there's been a discussion around whether the criteria I presented is actually possible to do or not, I will still really promote to have a look at them when we publish it, and also to think that even, okay, we cannot solve everything, but we can make it better for some person somewhere. Then that's already an advance. And I think that everyone here today is really engaged in the topic, and we tend to see perhaps that it's not going fast enough, and we forget all the advances that have been made, that we are actually sitting here discussing the gaps and not the complete lack of information. So this is really what I would like to say. What makes me go on in same positive is really those small steps, and being able to see when we talked with the pilots doing digital interfaces and with the users, and the sort of revelation that the pilots actually had, that these changes that they saw were so small in design elements actually make a difference for somebody, and to just see them realize that, yeah, I can actually do this. It doesn't cost me so much. All of these things makes it worth going on and working in this direction.
Yeah, wow. If anything that comes out of this that is an easy win for people, then wow, then we have really succeeded. So that's really a good way to end this. So thank you, our fantastic panelists. I'm sorry I needed to make you stop talking sometimes, but that is my job as a moderator. I know that we will keep this discussion going for a long time. Thank you for everyone discussing in the chat, and a lot of good ideas and discussions going on there. And special thanks to our interpreters, Robert, Tina, and Julia, have done a fantastic job with all these fast speaking people. Thank you for keeping up with us and being so always perfect in your delivery. And with this, I will just, well, thank you to Sarah, of course, for making this possible, and for leading this project in a brilliant way, as always, and also being the strategic leader of the Research and Innovation Department at Funka. I didn't get your title right the first time, I think. So, and also Eva for all the technical help. And with that, it's 3:02, so we need to close this, but thanks everyone, and have a fantastic weekend.
Thank you.